The gavel slammed, and the room froze, and Emily Carter said, "Not guilty," as if the words were shards in her throat. The judge stared ahead while the crowd inhaled in one jagged breath that did not end. David Mitchell said, "Breathe," but the air felt like glass. Marcus Hayes watched from the aisle, jaw tight, hands hidden in his pockets like a sealed confession. Victoria Langston smiled without teeth, a dignified shadow poised behind counsel table. Samantha Brooks lingered near the door, 16 and silent, eyes bright with a secret that could ignite the room. Emily whispered, "The dead can't hear this," and her hands trembled against the polished bench. Somewhere a phone buzzed, insistent as a trapped fly, and no one answered. The court reporter kept typing, capturing every fracture like rain on tin. David said, "We will appeal," and the words felt soft and heavy at once. Emily imagined the unread letter in her pocket and tasted metal. Victoria turned, offering a nod that felt like a verdict of its own. Outside the courthouse the rain felt like penance, and Emily Carter said, "They cheered inside their eyes." David Mitchell opened an umbrella and guided her down the slick steps with practiced care. Marcus Hayes kept to the edge, phone in pocket, gaze measuring the crowd. Samantha Brooks trailed 2 landings above, pretending to study the marble veins. Emily whispered, "I keep hearing the gavel in my bones," and a siren wailed 3 blocks away like an alarm set years ago. David said, "You are not alone," and his voice spread like heat from a cup not yet sipped. Victoria Langston emerged beneath a black canopy, untouched by rain, and nodded to unseen hands. Emily looked at the envelope in her pocket and almost reached for it. Marcus said, "Car is ready," and his tone carried no judgment, only arrival. Samantha said, "You don't know what you don't know," and the words clung like wet wool. Emily stepped off the final stair and did not slip. The diner smelled like coffee that had learned patience, and Emily Carter said, "I never finish it." David Mitchell slid a mug toward her and did not insist. Neon from the window wrote red letters across the formica, like a warning half remembered. Marcus Hayes sat in the corner booth, as always, where he could see the door and the kitchen pass. Samantha Brooks traced circles in condensation and watched the street. Emily muttered, "Someone paid for silence," and the napkin tore under her thumb. David said, "Then we find their receipt," and his smile was steadier than the clock. The television above the counter replayed the verdict, muted, captions marching like ants. Victoria Langston appeared on screen for 2 seconds, calm as marble in rain. Samantha said, "I know where the paper lives," and the room exhaled. Marcus's knuckles tapped once and stopped. Emily Carter unfolded the envelope and did not read, and she whispered, "It's older than I am now." The paper smelled like basements and winter closets. David Mitchell said, "We read when ready," and his hand did not touch hers, though it could have. Samantha Brooks watched with a storm behind her lashes. Marcus Hayes stared at the door as if time would enter on cue. The television murmured a weather alert for flood-prone streets, and it felt on theme. Emily said, "If I open it, I choose the next life." David said, "Justice is a choice repeated," and the neon flicker agreed. Samantha added, "The file is in the records basement under a changed name," and her voice made the coffee ripple. Marcus said, "We now," and the check appeared without asking. The envelope stayed closed but closer. The records building groaned with old air, and Emily Carter said, "Basements hold what courts refuse." David Mitchell carried a flashlight like a quiet promise. Marcus Hayes scanned the exits and memorized the turns without speaking. Samantha Brooks led the way, steps quick, hand skimming labels that lied. The hall bulbs flickered in a rhythm that felt like breath trying to steady. Emily whispered, "If we find it, someone will notice," and the dust rose as if nodding. David said, "Then we will be noticed together," and the beam brightened on a locked cabinet. Samantha said, "Different name, same blood," and pointed to a misfiled ledger. Marcus produced a key card that should not have been his. The lock clicked, and Emily's heart answered. Dawn scraped the sky when Emily Carter said, "If I stop moving, the night wins." David Mitchell poured fresh coffee and let the steam answer first. Samantha Brooks sketched exits on a napkin and said, "Basement opens at 8. Marcus Hayes reviewed a quiet list and nodded once. Emily touched the sealed letter and said, "He wrote this before the fire." David said, "Your pace is the plan, not the panic." The diner clock clicked like a metronome for fragile resolve. Samantha said, "The file name is a birthday just wrong by 1 digit." Marcus said, "Then we test the wrong one." Emily pictured Daniel's grin and felt the room tilt. David said, "We make space for grief and for facts." Emily breathed, and the day consented. They reached the memorial wall by the river, and Emily Carter said, "I come here to remember, not to forgive." Wind lifted loose flyers and hissed through chains. David Mitchell said, "Memory is a witness, not a judge." Samantha Brooks pressed a charcoal rubbing and said, "His name was carved shallow." Marcus Hayes scanned the benches and said, "We are not alone here." Emily traced Daniel Carter's letters and felt cold glass beneath. A cyclist slowed, then sped up like doubt reconsidered. David said, "Your brother's voice can guide without drowning you." Samantha said, "The records clerk pulls at 8:30. Marcus said, "Cameras on the footbridge, 2 angles." Emily said, "No more detours," and the river agreed. The records desk opened with a sigh, and Emily Carter said, "We need files on the Langston Trust." The clerk blinked at the request like a tired metronome. David Mitchell said, "Public documents, no restriction," and slid a form across. Samantha Brooks said, "Try the birthday with the wrong month." Marcus Hayes stood where reflections hid his eyes. The search terminal lagged, then coughed up a thin index. Emily said, "These are cross-referenced by grant code." David said, "Follow the code to the donor shells." Samantha said, "Found a ledger stamped after the fire." Marcus said, "Checkout requires supervisor approval." Emily said, "Then we ask," and she did not flinch. Supervisor glass reflected the hallway, and Emily Carter said, "Transparency is policy, yes." David Mitchell smiled like a patient bridge. Samantha Brooks said, "Ledger 14C, subgrant 9, misdated by 1 day." Marcus Hayes produced a polite card and said, "We appreciate your time." The supervisor stalled, then asked for a higher authorization. Emily said, "Victoria Langston's Foundation funds your archive." Silence became the loudest thing in the room. David said, "We can file a public request and wait." Samantha said, "Or we can notice a box mislabeled for disposal." Marcus said, "Chain of custody can be honored and examined." Emily said, "Choose law or favor," and the glass did not blink. They stepped into the stairwell for air, and Emily Carter said, "Langston built the maze." David Mitchell said, "Mazes have maps just hidden." Samantha Brooks held up a phone photo and said, "Box 14C is on the disposal cart." Marcus Hayes said, "2 cameras, cover that landing." Emily felt the letter like a pulse in her coat. David said, "We proceed visible and correct." Samantha said, "Visible gets the box moved." Marcus said, "Then we create a record that moves with us." Emily said, "I will sign the request now." Somewhere above, a cartwheel squeaked like a small alarm. The stairs smelled like dust and old paint, and the day leaned forward. The cart squeaked again, and Emily Carter said, "They are already moving it." David Mitchell steadied her with a hand gesture and said, "We follow procedure, not panic." Samantha Brooks whispered, "Disposal room key is unmarked but taped under the desk." Marcus Hayes said, "That means someone expects us to fail quietly." The stairwell carried echoes like old ghosts, reminding Emily of Daniel's laughter before the fire. Emily whispered, "I cannot lose him twice." David said, "Grief is not a failure, it is fuel." Samantha drew a quick map on the back of a receipt and said, "This way cuts the cameras." Marcus said, "Every shortcut is also a trap." Emily looked at the door and said, "Then let us spring it on our terms." The door hinge groaned like a reluctant witness. They entered the file disposal room, and Emily Carter said, "It smells like secrets burned slow." David Mitchell lifted his flashlight and said, "Order hides in chaos if we look close." Samantha Brooks crouched and said, "Box 14C is tucked behind the wrong bin." Marcus Hayes closed the door and said, "This room is not supposed to lock from inside." Emily's pulse felt louder than the humming fluorescent. David said, "We work fast but stay exact." Samantha tugged at the mislabeled box and said, "It weighs more than it should." Marcus said, "Evidence never travels alone." Emily pressed her palms flat and said, "Then it holds more than a ledger." A muffled knock sounded from the other side of the wall. The box opened with a dusty sigh, and Emily Carter said, "This was never meant to surface." David Mitchell scanned the ledger pages and said, "The dates match the fire, but the donors do not." Samantha Brooks said, "Victoria Langston's initials repeat like a watermark." Marcus Hayes closed a file slowly and said, "She funded the cleanup before the flames." Emily felt Daniel's name appear in a margin like a ghost signature. David said, "They paid to erase, not to rebuild." Samantha said, "Someone changed his status from victim to absent." Marcus said, "That means someone profited." Emily whispered, "He was not absent, he was taken," and the dust rose as if to confirm it. The door rattled, and Emily Carter said, "They know we are inside." David Mitchell said, "We stall, not surrender." Samantha Brooks whispered, "Vent shaft leads to stairwell 2. Marcus Hayes said, "If we leave now we carry nothing." Emily tightened her grip on the ledger and said, "I will not leave him behind again." David said, "Then we carry truth at any cost." Samantha climbed toward the vent and said, "This path is not safe, but it is open." Marcus said, "Every move leaves a shadow trail." Emily said, "Then let them follow ghosts," and she pulled the ledger against her chest. Outside, a key scraped into the lock. The vent spat them into the stairwell, and Emily Carter said, "This feels like running from the fire again." David Mitchell steadied her elbow and said, "This time you run toward truth." Samantha Brooks crouched, catching breath, and said, "We still have the ledger." Marcus Hayes brushed dust from his suit and said, "The cameras saw our exit." Emily looked down the stairwell and said, "Then Langston sees us now." David said, "Visibility is survival when secrets rot." Samantha said, "We deliver before they reclaim it." Marcus said, "Then every step matters twice." Emily pressed the ledger flat to her chest and said, "Daniel waits in every page," and the stairwell air felt heavier than stone. The safe house walls smelled of mildew, and Emily Carter said, "Every step drags us deeper." David Mitchell set the ledger on the table and said, "Evidence lives when witnesses fade." Samantha Brooks scrawled arrows in her sketchbook and said, "Every grant points to Langston's inner circle." Marcus Hayes locked the door and said, "Inner circles close fast when threatened." Emily flipped a page and saw Daniel Carter's name misfiled under beneficiaries. Her breath caught like a wound reopening. David said, "His name was used, not honored." Samantha whispered, "Absent doesn't mean gone, it means hidden." Marcus leaned into the shadows and said, "This trail ends inside Langston's office." Emily pressed her fist to the table and said, "Then we bring the trail to light, even if it burns." The television flickered with breaking news, and Emily Carter said, "They are already rewriting it." David Mitchell pointed at the chyron and said, "Langston Foundation pledges funds for memorial relief." Samantha Brooks snapped a photo of the screen and said, "She is burying truth with flowers." Marcus Hayes said, "That is how power defends itself." Emily said, "Daniel's name will not be used as currency." David said, "We turn their stage into confession." Samantha said, "Then we have to make the box speak louder than her broadcast." Marcus said, "The press room is guarded, but microphones crave words." Emily looked at the ledger and said, "We let his name speak for itself." The records clerk met them in a parking garage, and Emily Carter said, "You risk more than we do." The clerk handed a folder and said, "Risk lives in silence, not speech." David Mitchell flipped the folder open and said, "These signatures tie directly to Langston's trust." Samantha Brooks said, "This page links to the day of the fire." Marcus Hayes scanned the structure and said, "And here is the payout," before the smoke cleared. Emily whispered, "Daniel's death was ledgered before it was lived." David said, "They profited on tragedy like stock." Samantha said, "Then truth is our currency now." Marcus said, "We protect this folder as blood." Emily pressed the folder to her chest and said, "Daniel will not vanish again." They spread the folder across the motel bed, and Emily Carter said, "This is more than evidence. This is motive." David Mitchell said, "Langston's power rests on erased names." Samantha Brooks said, "And Daniel's is carved in ink that cannot fade." Marcus Hayes said, "Then we prepare for her strike." Emily whispered, "Every page is a blade against her silence." David said, "Truth cuts, but we must choose where it lands." Samantha said, "It lands in the press room tomorrow morning." Marcus said, "Then tonight we protect the blade." Emily pressed her forehead to the papers and said, "Daniel, we are almost there." The knock came at midnight, and Emily Carter said, "She sends shadows before dawn." David Mitchell whispered, "Stay calm, shadows break in light." Samantha Brooks clutched the ledger and said, "We cannot let it leave our hands." Marcus Hayes drew a small recorder and said, "Everything said tonight becomes evidence." Emily pressed the envelope against her chest and said, "Daniel, guide me through this storm." David stood by the peephole and said, "Two men, not police, not press." Samantha said, "Langston's reach is longer than the law." Marcus said, "Then we capture her reach on record." Emily whispered, "The truth knocks harder than they do," and the door shook under the second knock. The press room pulsed with microphones, and Emily Carter said, "This is where ghosts speak." David Mitchell smoothed his notes and said, "We only need one truth louder than their lies." Samantha Brooks whispered, "Ledger is in my bag, safe." Marcus Hayes scanned the room and said, "Cameras are not ours, they are hers." Emily clutched the envelope like a lifeline. David said, "We speak anyway." Samantha said, "They will try to drown us." Marcus said, "Then we keep our heads above their flood." Emily whispered, "Daniel, walk with me." The velvet curtain rustled, and Victoria Langston's voice filled the room before her face appeared. Victoria Langston stood tall, and Emily Carter said, "You profited from ashes." Victoria smiled faintly and said, "My foundation rebuilt lives." David Mitchell raised the ledger and said, "Funds diverted before the fire even burned." Samantha Brooks said, "Daniel Carter's name was forged into absence." Marcus Hayes said, "And payouts were wired the morning of the flames." The crowd gasped, cameras flashing like lightning. Emily whispered, "Justice is not a slogan," and her voice cracked but carried. Victoria's eyes stayed steady, her silence sharp as glass. David said, "You erased lives and called it charity." Samantha said, "We bring them back in ink." Marcus said, "And now the record speaks." Reporters shouted questions, and Emily Carter said, "You cannot bury a brother in paperwork." Victoria Langston said, "Your grief clouds your reason." David Mitchell answered, "Reason is written in signatures and dates." Samantha Brooks said, "Your initials stain every transaction." Marcus Hayes leaned forward and said, "The public sees what you built on bones." Emily pressed the envelope flat against the podium. Victoria said, "This is defamation." David said, "This is documentation." Samantha said, "And truth doesn't vanish when shouted over." Marcus said, "Every lens here records it twice." Emily whispered, "Daniel, your voice returns tonight." The tension snapped, and Emily Carter said, "My brother was not absent, he was silenced." David Mitchell said, Ledger lines cannot erase the dead. Samantha Brooks shouted, "You sold tragedy as profit." Marcus Hayes said, "And now the world knows." Victoria Langston smiled, but her eyes narrowed like knives. Emily lifted the envelope and said, "Inside is his last letter, untouched until now." David whispered, "This is your moment." Samantha said, "Read it." Marcus said, "Truth belongs in daylight." Emily opened the flap, her hands shaking as if the paper breathed. Victoria shifted for the first time, her composure cracking. Emily Carter unfolded the paper, and her voice trembled. "If you hear this, I did not make it home." The room hushed, reporters frozen. David Mitchell whispered, "Let him speak." Samantha Brooks gripped the podium and said, "His words outlive their lies." Marcus Hayes said, "Every letter carries more weight than gold." Emily read, "Do not let them use my name to wash their hands." Tears blurred her vision, but her voice held. Victoria Langston's mask broke, her jaw tightening, eyes flashing with fear. David said, "The dead indict you now." Samantha whispered, "Daniel lives in this truth." Marcus said, "And the world will remember." Emily finished, "Justice is not for me, but for us all." The courthouse steps glistened with rain when Emily Carter said, "Justice does not end in a verdict, it begins in memory." David Mitchell placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You carried truth past their walls." Samantha Brooks clutched her sketchbook and said, "The world finally saw the ink." Marcus Hayes scanned the gathering crowd and said, "Langston's mask has cracks that will not mend." Emily whispered, "Daniel stood with us today." David said, "And tomorrow his name will carry weight that power cannot erase." Samantha said, "Every camera caught it, every word was recorded." Marcus said, "The battle shifts to their courtrooms now." Emily looked at the wet stone beneath her feet and said, "Justice begins again with every step." The motel room felt smaller, and Emily Carter said, "Truth is heavy even after it's spoken." David Mitchell folded the ledger carefully and said, "Truth must also be protected." Samantha Brooks curled on the chair and said, "We put Daniel back where they tried to erase him." Marcus Hayes stood by the door and said, "Now they will test us with silence or noise." Emily brushed dust from the envelope and said, "Daniel's voice belongs to the world, not to them." David said, "And his letter now lives beyond your hands." Samantha said, "I copied every page. It can't vanish now." Marcus said, "Then we hold the light until it blinds them." Emily said, "Justice breathes tonight, even in shadows." The memorial wall shone under moonlight, and Emily Carter said, "Daniel, your name is no longer absent." David Mitchell said, "Your memory is carved deeper now." Samantha Brooks pressed a sketch to the wall and said, "I drew him so no one forgets his face." Marcus Hayes stood behind them and said, "The truth outlives the lie." Emily laid the letter beneath the stone and said, "I kept it sealed until you could be heard." David said, "He speaks through you now." Samantha whispered, "The dead don't vanish, they shift into echoes." Marcus said, "Echoes grow louder when answered." Emily said, "Then let the world hear him forever." In the diner again, Emily Carter said, "Silence tastes different now." David Mitchell sipped coffee and said, "You finished it this time." Samantha Brooks laughed softly and said, "That's a first." Marcus Hayes leaned in the corner and said, "Some endings are beginnings." Emily said, "Daniel does not return, but his truth walks among us." David said, "And the ledger carries more than numbers, it carries memory." Samantha said, "I wrote his name in every margin I could find." Marcus said, "Let them chase their shadows while we walk in light." Emily smiled faintly and said, "Coffee tastes like tomorrow, not yesterday." The safehouse lights dimmed for the last time, and Emily Carter said, "The fight never ends, but tonight it rests." David Mitchell locked the ledger in a steel box and said, "Truth survives in layers." Samantha Brooks stretched on the couch and said, "Tomorrow we write again." Marcus Hayes checked the window and said, "And tomorrow we watch again." Emily whispered, "Daniel, You breathe in every step we take. David said, you carried his voice past silence. Samantha said, you let the world hear him. Marcus said, and they can never silence him again. Emily said, justice sleeps but it dreams loud. The dawn broke pale and cold, and Emily Carter said, morning feels heavier when truth is public. David Mitchell said, heavier, but not hidden. Samantha Brooks snapped a photo of the rising sun and said, Daniel gets his sky back. Marcus Hayes leaned on the railing and said, Langston's empire fractures today. Emily pressed the letter against her chest and whispered, he spoke, and the world listened. David said, the echoes will keep moving. Samantha said, and the cracks become doors. Marcus said, power does not vanish, but fear weakens it. Emily said, justice does not heal, but it breathes. They returned to the diner, and Emily Carter said, every ending returns us here. David Mitchell poured coffee and said, this time, you will finish it. Samantha Brooks smiled and said, no sketches, just breakfast. Marcus Hayes said, the world outside still spins with noise. Emily said, but inside here, silence means peace. David said, peace is earned in fragments. Samantha said, we built a piece of it. Marcus said, it will not last unless we guard it. Emily whispered, Daniel, today I finished the cup. The memorial glistened with rain again, and Emily Carter said, this wall no longer feels like stone. David Mitchell said, it feels like witness. Samantha Brooks pressed her palm against Daniel's name and said, he belongs in the open now. Marcus Hayes said, names endure where lies crumble. Emily whispered, I am no longer only surviving. David said, you are carrying. Samantha said, you are speaking. Marcus said, you are leading. Emily closed her eyes and said, Daniel, you live here not in shadows. The motel emptied of papers, and Emily Carter said, this room no longer carries fear. David Mitchell said, it carries proof of survival. Samantha Brooks sketched the empty table and said, a memory of what we fought for. Marcus Hayes closed the last box and said, and now we lock the past. Emily whispered, justice never sleeps. It waits in rooms like this. David said, then we leave the light behind. Samantha said, and carry the ink forward. Marcus said, empty rooms can echo victories. Emily said, then let this one echo Daniel's. The street light flickered outside the safe house, and Emily Carter said, justice never closes its eyes. David Mitchell said, it waits in the spaces between verdicts. Samantha Brooks whispered, it waits in names not yet spoken. Marcus Hayes said, and in records not yet burned. Emily pressed the letter into her coat and whispered, Daniel waits in every silence, every breath, every dawn. David said, and now the world waits with you. Samantha said, and I will keep sketching until his face lives everywhere. Marcus said, and I will guard until silence itself breaks. Emily closed her eyes and said, justice is a haunting that will not leave.